All right, so then I would say welcome to today's webinar on the latest EU Omnibus agreement. So earlier this week, this Tuesday, the European Parliament adopted the ESG Omnibus, finally, which includes the CSDDD, but also the CSRD. And in today's webinar, we want to take a closer look at what really has changed and what that also means for your compliance and due diligence efforts in practice. And for that webinar, I'm joined by two experts on the field, which is on the one hand, Niels Pöhl, our head of public affairs at Prewave, who is following the developments very closely in Brussels, and also Sebastian Rünz, also long-term partner at Prewave, joining us here today to give the interpretation of what has been adopted this week. So let's look at the agenda. First, we want to look a bit behind the scenes, and Niels will give us an interpretation of where we landed with the ESG Omnibus agreement and also why we landed there, and maybe what's also in store coming next. Then we will look a bit more concretely at the legal updates and what precisely is now the state of the final CSDDD as it was adopted by Parliament earlier this week. And then we will have a deep dive into the risk-based approach, which is really at the heart of the CSDDD, and will really govern the way companies are approaching and adopting due diligence under the CSDDD. And of course, we will leave plenty of room for Q&A at the end. There is a Q&A section in the Zoom webinar where you can also ask us questions already during the webinar. If it makes sense, we will get to the question. If not, we will get to it at the end of the webinar. Also, this webinar is recorded. We will share both the recording and the slides for the webinar with you afterwards in a follow-up email. And with that, I would like to hand over to Niels to give us a first snapshot of what happened this week and where we are with the Omnibus simplification process.
Thank you, Harald. And yes, nice to meet you all, even though it's virtual. So you are more seeing me than I am seeing you. But I'm the head of public affairs at Prewave, working in Brussels, basically with the political stakeholders and, of course, also industry associations, etc. Before we dive into the ESG Omnibus, I think it's helpful to paint a little bit of the wider landscape because there are so many abbreviations, so many simplification efforts ongoing so that everyone is on the same page. So I think we had, first of all, the first simplification was actually to the carbon border adjustment mechanism, where we had this exemption threshold being changed, which means that much less of the import of aluminium and steel are subject to CBAM. This process has been completed, though CBAM is a beast that keeps growing. So we had a lot of technical rules actually being published yesterday, also discussion now to extend it. So I think it's good to consider that the dynamics of CBAM are slightly different than the rest of sustainability, because CBAM also has this protecting industry element to it. So yes, the simplification is done, but the instrument still continues actually. On EUDR, we've seen also a simplification measure now, all the downstream, the requirement to pass on due diligence statements basically, and as well a year delay, which has been also more or less politically adopted now. And here there is still a review in 26, and there may be a reopening if considered necessary, but there we have to see. That ESG Omnibus, the big bill that is amending the reporting requirements, the due diligence frameworks, and the taxonomy rules. That's what we will be discussing today. This now also with the vote 2 days ago has been more or less adopted. Here one more thing is happening though. The CSRD is mostly defined actually in the reporting standards. And these still need to be officially tabled by the Commission. So there is a technical proposal which the Commission now has to work out into an official proposal that doesn't take much time because it is almost a direct translation, but then there is still some scrutiny period, so probably mid-2026 we have clarity on how the reporting will look like, but we now roughly know where it will end up. And then quite at the beginning we are for the environmental omnibus, but this is more emissions, circular economy, a lot of product specific rules, so a bit separate than the more corporate framework that we are discussing in the ESG omnibus. I think we can go to the next slide. So what does the deal on headline level really mean? I think first of all, it's fair to say that this does push simplification quite significantly beyond what the Commission intended. So much fewer companies will be in scope. And also, I think quite important is that the climate change transition plan requirement, which was in CSDDD, is removed from the CSDDD. There is still in CSRD a requirement that if a company has a transition plan, they will have to report on it, but there is no standalone requirement anymore and no references on the implementation, which was part of CSDDD. There are, however, other regulations, so it is not to say that nothing has to be done, but at least it's gone in this part. I think important, and that will be the main topic of today, is of course that we saw the resurrection almost of the risk-based approach instead of a direct supplier approach, which was the initial proposal of the Commission in February. So, and I think maybe we can go then a little bit more into the details of how we basically got here. No? So I think it is important to say we started in 24 with statements around removing duplications and really a technical simplification effort. What the Commission proposed in February 25 was already going beyond that, but then there was very clear from Chancellor Merz and from President Macron clear statements that they wanted to go much further than what the Commission proposed. And basically the message was go big on simplification or lose it all. Now, there were really clearly signals, if we don't simplify this, we may need to consider if we want to have this at all, especially for the CSDDD. That as well had its reflection then on the side of Parliament, where basically the Conservatives were willing to say, okay, if we cannot get a deal with the Social Democrats and the Liberals, we are willing to use the right-wing majority in Parliament to get the simplification done. And that meant that we got, independent of what then later happened with the vote, we got already to a Parliament mandate that was much more aligned with what the Commission wanted. For instance, they both agreed on this 5,000 employee threshold. And that meant that the Commission lost its ability to be an active broker. Usually in trilogues, we see that the Commission is quite good by being the one holding the pen to actually bring in, keep a lot of their proposal, or at least the spirit of the proposal alive. But in this case, in the trilogues, they were much more a facilitator and much less this active broker. I think then maybe two things to give a little bit of the detail on the substance. The risk-based approach was interesting how it made its way back into the deal, because basically the CSDDD that we had the risk-based approach. And then what happened is then when the simplification was such a political exercise that the technical people that were involved with the drafting of the CSDDD were no longer involved when the when pen was put to paper. And that meant that we on February suddenly were a little bit surprised that we got this direct supplier approach. Some in corporate, in the business side, like this because from a legal perspective, it is a bit easier to tick boxes if it's their direct suppliers, of course. So it was initially not possible to get rid of this. So we saw in the member states as well that this direct supplier approach was still taking over. But then in the summer, when the political attention moved a little bit to other files, and when there was in Parliament an attempt to get a grand coalition together of the left and the right, this was the way that the right in the end said, okay, maybe we do the risk-based approach, and then the left will agree with us that smaller companies need to be out of scope and that this will only be for large companies. And that's then basically what came in the Parliament deal. We know, of course, what happened next was that there was an agreement with the leadership, but then the Social Democrats didn't manage to actually deliver the votes. So we had a vote that fell through, and then the right made a coalition with the far right, but in the final parliament mandate, they didn't touch the risk-based approach, so that remained. They were lukewarm on it, they were not pushing very hard for it, but in the meantime, member states also started seeing the added value of this risk-based approach, because what does it do? On the one hand, it has more impact, because actually you want companies to know the supply chain for resilience, for instance, but also the risks are likely to be outside of Europe. And that means if you don't have a direct supplier argumentation, you actually have a chance that the burden of the due diligence actually doesn't fall on European companies, but outside. So from a simplification as perspective, it made sense. So that is why we then in the end ended up with a risk-based approach, with member states basically pushing parliament to deliver what they had in their mandate. And for transition plans, it was a little bit the opposite. Here, actually, because of the far right joining, transition plan requirement fell out of the parliament mandate, so it was deleted in the parliament mandate. And member states on the same time saw some pressure as well, for instance, for the US, also from Qatar. Officially, of course, this was not the reason, but we know that in those trilogue meetings, these dynamics were discussed as well. And for Parliament, now having a right-wing mandate, it was a priority to get it out. And then for member states, it was a way to get maybe some of the third country headaches resolved a little bit. So that's how we ended up without a transition plan requirement in the final text. And I think maybe one last word then on what happens next. So I think we can go to the next slide. So I think it's fair to say that even though we could say, okay, we should maybe move now the attention to the single market, capital markets reform and all those things, it is highly likely that simplification and getting rid of too many rules will remain focus of policymakers. But this will probably move to new topics now, to product-specific rules, environmental rules. The corporate framework has now been set, so attention will probably shift. And on the other hand, I think what we shouldn't forget is that the economic security concerns and the feeling that we need to understand better what dependencies we have in supply chains and what disruption risks there are is growing almost with the day in Brussels and among policymakers. So in the same time as we were discussing this simplification, the Commission published a new economic security doctrine, also a new strategy on raw materials. And there it says very clearly that large companies will need to carry out risk assessment of their supply chains and adopt as necessary mitigation measures. And actually, there are already a lot of legal provisions that form a basis for asking companies to do audits and stress tests. At the moment, they don't really have teeth. So it depends a little bit on how will member states actually give shape to those. But we do see a dynamic that there is really a look at how can we work on this. And I think there is an expectation that we could see due diligence requirements still happening, even though it may be more from the resilience side and a bit less driven by sustainability. And I think then it's political picture is drafted, and then let's go into the reality of the legal questions and the practitioner answers to it.
Thank you, Niels. Thank you for the insights and the look behind the curtain, so to speak. But yeah, let's now, Sebastian, I'd like to ask you now to give us the look at the cold hard facts, of what was not really adopted, and where do we stand with the CSDDD as it was adopted, also versus the originally adopted pre-omnibus version. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you, Harald. So what is new due to the omnibus? So one huge change is the scope of application. While the original scope was more than 1,000 employees and an annual turnover of 450 million, now after the trilogue, the scope is 5,000 employees, more than 5,000 employees, and an annual turnover of 1.5 billion. So only much larger companies fall under the scope of the CSDDD. When you look at the numbers, this means that the scope was reduced by roughly around 80%. So right now we have much less companies falling under the CSDDD. When you look at the member states, then most countries falling under the CSDDD are based in Germany, then France, Italy. Some member states, surprisingly, are not mentioned at all, at least at the tables that I found. So I don't know if they even have companies that reach the thresholds. When you look at certain countries, then there might be just 10 companies left that actually reach those thresholds. So the scope has been narrowed down enormously. What happened as well is the CSDDD was postponed by another year, so 2 years in total now, because the original idea was to have it applied from 2027 onwards in 3 stages. Now we are in 2029. So almost 4 years left until the CSDDD applies. And another aspect also interesting that has been cut out of the CSDDD is the civil liability, which in the original version was still included, so that it is possible for people affected by potential violations to sue at civil courts for damages. This has been removed. This has always been a core of the discussions, whether this should be included in the CSDDD, because, of course, certain groups argue that individuals or NGOs thereby could bring many cases to courts, whether it makes sense or not, whether there are grounds to the case or not, just to basically make it public and to basically drag companies into long litigation cases. So, but this is now removed, so we only have civil liability according to national laws. In the end, most of the time, we won't have a national law applying to the case of someone suing the company, because most of those problems occur outside, human rights problems occur outside the EU. And according to European law, typically the law of the country where the damage happens applies. So this would most likely not be the the law of an EU member state. But even if we would have the national law applied, then most of the national laws, they don't have any clear civil liability for such cases. In particular, if the problem happened at the sphere of the supplier and not the company itself. So if there has been a human rights violation at a supplier, and the only discussion is whether the company falling under the CSDDD has complied with its due diligence obligations or not, then typically the national laws of the member states will not lead to a civil liability. Beside all those restrictions in scope and content-wise, there is one thing that is more or less the same, with some stricter wordings, but it still remains the same. And Niels, you already mentioned it, the risk assessment. So the original idea of the CSDDD was that the risk assessment also affects the deeper supply chain, not only tier one. And in the meanwhile, during the Omnibus process, we had some suggestions by the EU Commission to reduce this to tier one, also from the EU Council. But this now has been removed, and we are back at the risk-based approach with a focus also on the deeper supply chain, with some restrictions on what you are allowed to ask in your supply chain, but still you have to look at your deeper supply chain, and you cannot only focus on tier one. This is worth to mention because I think some people still have in mind, okay, now the CSDDD, as for example, the German Supply Chain Act only focuses on tier one, but this is not the case anymore. It also focuses on the deeper supply chain. You could, of course, add to this list here. These are just some of the most important things that change. You could also look at the climate transition plans, which have been removed. Sanctions have been reduced, while the original idea was that the minimum sanction is at the maximum sanction is at least 5%. Now the maximum penalty is at 3% of the annual group turnover. There have been changes in the definitions of stakeholder, in the frequency of the monitoring process, in the degree of harmonization. Now, basically, almost all the due diligence obligations are harmonized, meaning that the member states are not allowed to deviate from the provisions in the CSDDD. There are just some individual cases where this is still possible, for example, the risk management or the stakeholder engagement, but most of the due diligence statements, they now will be the same in all the member states: risk assessment, preventive, remedial measures. This, of course, helps to build a level playing field, so that in the end, CSDDD is not transposed into national law differently or interpreted differently in the member states. CSRD, we mentioned it here, we don't want to go into detail in this webinar, has also been adjusted. There has been a huge cut in the scope. So before we had originally an application for companies with 250 employees and a turnover of 40 million, which now has been increased to companies with more than 1,000 employees and a revenue of 450 million, which is a narrowing down of the scope by 90%, even more than the CSDDD with around 80%. We have a different timeline now with reports for the financial year 2027, not starting with financial year 2024, and so on. So I would suggest that we now have a poll, right? I wanted to say something different, but
no, good, Sebastian.
Harald.
Actually, already before we run the poll, a few questions already that popped up. The first one is regarding the timing. So previously there were these waves, right, of like phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. This is now gone, right? It's all one.
Correct.
Phase. Is that correct? Yeah.
Yeah.
Then the other question was about the application of the threshold, so the employees and the revenue. Is that an and or an or, a combination of these requirements?
It's both. You need to have both. Yeah.
And another question. So it's both. So both 5,000 and 1.5 billion.
Yeah. If you are below one of those thresholds, then you are not in the scope.
Another question is, if you have a group of companies and each individual company is below the threshold, but the group in total is above the thresholds, is then
Yeah,
the group in scope or not?
you would allocate, you would count together the number of employees and the turnover in the group, but it is described in a little bit more detail in the CSDDD, and it depends on the individual case, so where the the parent company is located. So in the end, to make it short, in order to be 100% certain, you would need to look at the individual case.
Mm-hmm. Got it. Okay, these were some of the first questions. There's others, but we will get to them at the end because they're a bit more detailed. But before we move ahead, we are curious where you, the audience, stands on the CSDDD journey. Let's put it like that. Not politically, but on the CSDDD implementation journey. For that, we would like to ask you a first question, which you should now see popping up on your screen, which is when do you plan to start implementing the CSDDD within your company, in case you are working at a company? Is this a project that's already ongoing, or is this something that's still under evaluation or in the future for you? First answers are coming in. We already have more than 30 answers. We wait maybe a few more seconds for the answers to come in, and then I end the poll, and then we all see, I think, the results. One question that came in, Sebastian, while we are waiting for the poll, also for the non-EU companies. So the CSDDD does also cover non-EU headquartered companies that are doing business in the European Union. Is that correct?
Correct. If those thresholds, if the threshold of 1.5 billion in turnover is generated within the EU.
Mm-hmm. Yes. All right, let's have a look at the results. I believe you should now see the results also on your screen. So we have 35% of respondents saying that their implementation is already ongoing. And then we have, I think, the majority or the largest share of respondents saying that it's still under evaluation, with a few saying it's 2026 or 2027, just 2% 2028. So yeah, let's say more than half actually already either implementing or planning to implement in the next 1 or 2 years, and the rest still evaluating. And yeah, we hope this webinar helps you evaluate when you should start. So let's maybe move on and dive into one of the maybe most relevant aspect of the CSDDD that will be applicable to companies then when they move from theory to practice, which is the risk-based approach. And the risk-based approach is nothing new. It's neither new to due diligence because it was more or less brought onto the scene by the United Nations Guiding Principles and the OECD guidelines, which already came earlier in the 2010s. It was also already enshrined in the CSDDD earlier versions, but it is now more explicit. And it has also made its comeback on the risk-based approach for the deeper supply chain. And to get a first overview of what the risk-based approach is, and also as a kind of reference point how it differs from the German Supply Chain Act approach, I would like to hand back to you, Sebastian.
So the CSDDD learns from the mistakes that happened under the German Supply Chain Act. At least that's my impression. So under the German Supply Chain Due Diligence Act, what companies needed to do was to basically look at all their tier 1 suppliers. and identify human rights and certain environmental risks at those tier 1 suppliers. With respect to the tier N suppliers, it was only necessary to do the risk assessment in case of substantial knowledge, which means that you have certain information that lead to the conclusion a certain human rights violation could happen at the tier 2, tier 3, tier 4, and so on level. But in practice, most companies, they were very hesitant in assuming a substantial knowledge. So in most of the cases, they were of the opinion, okay, we do not have substantial knowledge because we saw a media report somewhere and the television, this is not enough to constitute substantial knowledge. So this led to the situation in the end that basically everyone just looked at their tier 1 suppliers. But the tier 1 suppliers very often are also located in Germany or other member states. So most of the time there are no risks. And you look at suppliers that are not worth looking at, because maybe you look at the supplier who delivers you water for your offices, or products that were produced in Germany, in other member states where they are not associated with any human rights violations. So although this was also under discussion for the CSDDD, the CSDDD now has a scoping approach and not a supplier-based approach as the German Supply Chain Act, which means you do not have to look at all your tier 1 suppliers. You only need to look at your suppliers where adverse impacts are likely or severe. And whether adverse impacts are likely or severe can be identified by certain risk factors like geographical risks or sector risks or product-related risks. And only with respect to those suppliers, you need to take a closer look. And the second filter, you only need to look at the suppliers which are part of the chain of activities, meaning which are basically part of the production of your services or delivery of your products. Meaning if you buy something for the office, let's say toilet paper, then this is not something that goes into your product that you are selling to your customer or to the service you are providing your customer. So this is not, or it could be well argued, this is not a part of the chain of activity. So again, also to those suppliers, you don't have to do a in-depth assessment. So this narrows down the number of suppliers you need to look at on the tier 1 level, but of course, maybe on the tier N level, you also identify some adverse impacts, and then you would also need to look at those suppliers and probably do an in-depth assessment. So less work on the tier 1 level, but maybe more work on the tier N level. This really depends on how your supply chain looks like. If you have a supply chain where also at the tier 2 and so on level there are no risks, then the CSDDD in the end may be less work for you than the German Supply Chain Act. Of course, if the supply chain of your product is very problematic regarding human rights violations in the deeper part of the supply chain, this could be mean more work for you under the CSDDD. But you have to do the scoping exercises, meaning you have to find areas where human rights violations are likely and severe, and only in those areas you need to take a closer look at the suppliers.
So now you have a first overview of the scoping approach and how it differentiates from the supplier-based approach, and also that the deeper supply chain or the tier N or N-tier supply chain is part of the assessment. So we would like to also launch the next poll, which asks the question, which of you and your companies already does conduct a risk-based due diligence of the deeper supply chain. Obviously, something that is a process which involves collaboration with the suppliers, an accurate scoping, and decisions on where to actually bring the transparency to the supply chain, and investment of also resources into making the supply chain more transparent. Let's have a look at the results. So we actually see from the results that 35% already do have approach for looking at risks in the deeper supply chain and following due diligence in the deeper supply chain. 65%, so around 2/3, do not. Sebastian, does this match your experience also from talking with clients?
Yeah, it's what I have had guessed. So I think quite realistic numbers, because I mean, as long as you are not obliged to look at your deeper supply chain, why should you do it? So far, the only reason is that you have a problematic supply chain, and you want to make sure that there are no violations in the deeper supply chain. But if that is not the case, because you are sure that your deeper supply chain is not related to human rights risks, then it's understandable that companies haven't done this exercise, because it could mean a lot of work.
Absolutely, yeah. All right, let's take a bit of a closer look at this risk-based approach. Laying out here kind of the step-by-step approach that also the Article 8 of the CSDDD outlines. So we have Article 8, which is the identify and assess adverse impacts part, really outlining the risk assessment portion of the CSDDD, and then followed by the appropriate measures. But if you look at this Article 8, it really breaks or boils down into two paragraphs. Paragraph 2A, which is the scoping, which is what we just discussed, this identification of general areas of risk or general areas where adverse impacts are most likely and severe. And here, again, we do not look at individual suppliers, but rather we look at combinations of categories and countries. So broadly understanding where is the risk most likely among our tier 1 suppliers, but where also in the deeper supply chain are the risks most severe and likely. And that is then followed by the in-depth assessment, where we then, for these areas that we have scoped, where we do see adverse impacts, so risks to be likely and severe, then we go a step deeper and look at the actual suppliers or supply chains within these areas. This exercise of first scoping and then having the in-depth assessment has been part of the CSDDD pretty much from the beginning. It has not been called scoping, but rather often it was called mapping the general areas of risk. But what happened now in the latest draft is that really this terminology of scoping that was really also used already in the OECD due diligence guidelines for responsible business conduct. I think they were already brought in 2011. So quite some time ago. This is also where this terminology arose. And if we compare then how the OECD guidelines talk about scoping, it's about this process of identifying these general areas of risk, and then kind of subject to this more in-depth process in a second step. And we see that now the CSDDD really borrows heavily from this terminology that was also used in the OECD guidelines, which is a good thing. That means it's more aligned with the practice that many companies have also been following already for many years. And yeah, if we look at this Article 8 in a bit more detail, we see that it outlines that companies shall take measures taking account relevant risk factors, and these relevant risk factors include facts, situations, circumstances at the level of geography, so the country risk, the context, so what type of business relationship do I have, the sectors, also the products and services. So really understanding based on these risk factors, carrying out the scoping exercise based on these risk factors. Also, a key element of the scoping exercise is, and this is now very explicitly outlined in paragraph 2a, that it should be based solely on reasonably available information. And yeah, maybe Sebastian, do you have an interpretation on the reasonably available information or solely reasonably available information? Does this mean I should use what's available here in this step? And yeah, how can we interpret this?
Yeah, I can only guess. The wording of Article 8 is really horrible, and it is poorly drafted, to be honest. It seems like this is, Niels, you mentioned it before, due to political interests, how it was worded, and not very well from a legal perspective. So it seems that the wording shall make it a little bit easier for companies, shall guarantee that it is not too dangerous for companies with respect to potential fines. And it starts here in Article 8a with this expression reasonably available information. So it's not entirely clear what this means. I mean, how far does this go? My assumption would be that it has to be information that is already available somewhere. Based on sources that are available in the internet, open sources, or maybe sources you have to pay for, but in the end, sources that already exist, which could be indices or information you could find out if you just enter certain buzzwords online, like let's call it a web screening, but maybe not information that you would need to not only gather first, but that have to be drafted first. For example, a questionnaire, because a questionnaire is something, it is not available yet. You would need to send it to the supplier, and then the supplier need to answer your questions, and then you have the information you could use, but it's not available yet. It would be different if the supplier already answered questionnaires, for example, for a ESG rating, and already has an ESG rating based on answers he has given to the rating agency, and you could use those information already available on the company. But this is, again, just a guess. Maybe also questionnaires would be allowed at this point for the scoping exercise. We don't know for certain. Hopefully there will be some guidance, but my experience from guidance documents in Germany is it's not always making things clearer, and it's not always published in time. And companies are much faster preparing for laws like the CSDDD, and probably the guidance document will only be published sometime in 2028. Well, as we just saw in the poll, most companies already started to prepare.
So yeah, we certainly wait for the guidance to gain more clarity on what reasonably available really means. I think one intention that we do see in the CSDDD is to try to remove the burden from especially the smaller suppliers of being overwhelmed with questionnaires, being overwhelmed with information requests. We also see that in a point we will get to in just a bit on the information cap, also what you can request and are allowed to request from smaller suppliers. So I think one safe interpretation would be that here for the scoping step, you should not anyway perform it on individual supplier level, but rather on a category level. We have here a bit of a view that we have also used in previous webinars that still applies, kind of giving an idea of what is the scoping. The scoping is really not a process where we look at individual suppliers, but rather at a certain combinations, we call it clusters or areas of risk, such as, for instance, I'm procuring batteries out of Vietnam, or I'm procuring legal services out of Germany. Is that from a risk perspective? So obviously based on the risk categories and the risk factors that are in scope for the CSDDD, human rights and environmental risks. Is that a severe and likely risk or not? Yeah. And based on that, we can take certain decisions, whether we consider, for instance, batteries sourced out of Vietnam. So the direct tier one supplier, based on a combined scoring, we could say that is, or from a tier one perspective, a risky supplier, but also the supply chain behind that tier one supplier, raw materials that go into these batteries is risky. Versus, for instance, legal services I'm procuring out of Germany. It's neither a tier one risk from a human rights or environmental perspective, and also the supply chain behind the legal services is not a particular risky supply chains. So I would not take that in scope. I would rather take that out of scope. Without going into too much detail, at Prewave we have developed what's called a scoping dashboard, which supports companies to precisely do that exercise on possibly hundreds or thousands of suppliers. So in this scoping dashboard, we group your suppliers by country and commodity combinations. For instance, plastic sourced out of Italy or semiconductors sourced out of France. And then we give it a combined risk score for this cluster. And then companies can take decisions as to which are the most risky combinations. For instance, lithium-ion batteries sourced out of China. And those I take out of scope. So the suppliers that are then behind these areas that we scoped, we will then take into the further step, which is the in-depth assessment. And that would then bring us to the next step here, which is the in-depth assessment. And that's where we move from the general areas that we said were risky, such as batteries sourced out of Vietnam or China, onto the individual supplier level and try to understand the level of risk of that particular supplier, then also taking into account the individual maturity of that supplier. So yes, it's based in China. Yes, it's they're producing batteries, but also have they had any issues in the past? Have you received any grievance reports on that supplier? Any audit reports or audit schemes available for that supplier? Any certifications available for that supplier? So that is then where we move into the in-depth assessment of that supplier. And yeah, just to give a bit of an understanding also of the kind of tooling that you would need to run this process, but also the tooling that we as Prewave provide to our customers. So for this first step, we offer the scoping dashboard. for the tier N suppliers that are then scoped in, so the areas of risk. We offer the mapping functionality to then open up the deeper supply chain. We then run the 360-degree scoring, where we combine different sources of data, such as the media screening, the country and commodity risk, publicly available certifications or audit schemes, into then an overall scorecard that then moves into a deeper risk analysis, which is then the basis for selecting those suppliers where we really take action, for instance, move into trainings, audits, and building capacity at these high-risk suppliers. So that brings us to two final points we want to highlight. And we just talked about this idea of assessing suppliers in detail. And often when companies approach this assessment part of the suppliers, the first thing they think about is, let me send a questionnaire. And here, let's say the learnings, and Sebastian mentioned it in the beginning, the CSDDD, we see try to learn also from some of the mistakes from the German Supply Chain Act. They do try to put in some phrasings or wordings that try to limit this overwhelming number of questionnaires sent to also smaller suppliers. We see that here in the Article 3, paragraph 3a, where it says that for the purposes of the in-depth assessment, companies may request information from business partners or their suppliers only where that information is necessary. And in case of business partners with less than 5,000 employees, only when the information cannot reasonably be obtained by other means. So again, also we go back to the earlier interpretation from Sebastian. We need to wait for guidance. But yes, this can again lead us to this idea of maybe we look at what's publicly available. Is the supplier, for instance, publishing certain certifications on their website? Is it known through other databases or audit schemes that, for instance, the supplier has certain certifications or available? Then that can be used to also consider it into the in-depth assessment without asking the supplier. Sebastian, do you want to add anything also to this paragraph to point out what's relevant for the practical implementation?
Maybe just one small aspect regarding the necessary. Harald, you mentioned it when we were talking about this before this webinar. Probably means that you have to ask specific questions regarding the risk you identified. Meaning, if you identified child labor, then the in-depth assessment could contain questions on child labor, but not on I don't know, environmental aspects, which have nothing to do with the identified risk of child labor. So that it's basically a targeted set of questions and not a questionnaire with hundreds of questions. But again, this is very theoretical because it will, in practice, be handled differently depending on market powers. In many sectors, we have huge players which basically want their suppliers to ask to answer their questionnaires in the onboarding process, and these questionnaires will cover questions on all kind of topics. And I don't think that this will end with the CSDDD, and you could say it makes sense because a large company could say, well, I want to work with suppliers, only with suppliers that reach those thresholds and that fulfill my demands. Again, it's a wording that I think shall basically make it a little bit more secure for companies, so that they don't get the feeling, okay, I can do something wrong here, and then I will be fined under the CSDDD. But that's just my impression.
Yeah, I think maybe also, I mean, I have a past representing suppliers, so I may be a bit biased here still, but I remember that suppliers very often get requests from the, for instance, vehicle manufacturers or whatever the OEM is. Yeah, there's a new law, disclose all your suppliers, knowing that basically sometimes laws are also a little bit abused to get information. No, at least that's how it's perceived then on the supplier side. And then such a sentence, of course, gives a little bit of legal ammunition to say, okay, this is not the intention of the legislator. And behind the scenes, I think it's maybe worth saying that, of course, the Parliament really wanted this. This was a clear condition because they wanted to avoid all the questionnaires. On the other hand, it's a bit ironic that if you want to go to the market and then you are going to protect the market by actually intervening in contractual negotiations, because you're saying thou shall not ask from your supplier.
Oops. Sounds like Niels. Sebastian, are you still here?
I'm still here, but
okay.
Looks like Niels is gone.
Yeah. But yeah, I think we anyway with an eye on time, and we still want to answer some questions. Quickly go through the final 2 points. The one point that also is still important to mention is that the Article 8.3c also gives some guidance as to how to prioritize. So if you have a case where, based on the scoping exercise, tier 1 and tier N risks are equally likely in a certain area, then you can prioritize the tier 1, so the direct business partners, over the deeper supply chain. Maybe highlighting here a bit the idea of start acting where you have more leverage, and where you can more easily get to results, which is of course always the direct business partners or the direct tier 1 suppliers. And last but not least, the CSDDD now also explicitly gives some guidance to companies, that for the purposes of running the risk assessment, and we also have some questions here that go into okay, but what does it mean? What can we use now in terms of data? Can every company now decide for itself? Certainly, we also have seen this in other countries who have had national due diligence laws, that guidance will be given on what types of sources, indices, country, industry risks shall be used. But also here, the companies are entitled to make use of appropriate resources, including independent reports, digital solutions, industry and multi-stakeholder initiatives, and complaints procedures that is also required for the CSDDD. So outlining here that, let's say, these resources can also be used as part and shall be used as part of the risk assessment. And with that, we want to move into maybe answering some questions. Sebastian, have you already spotted some questions you might want to go into?
I already answered quite a lot, and I'm still going through them.
Fantastic. Maybe I can take one. Likely or severe adverse impacts. Is there any guidance, definition as to what those are? Yes, in the OECD guidelines and the UNGPs, which are really the foundation. Also, there are often in the FAQs or definitions more criteria given as to what makes a risk or an adverse impact more likely or severe. For instance, severity is based in many cases on this idea of the irremediability, the scope and the scale, so how many people are affected, to which extent are human rights violated. It's always hard to give examples here, but let's say a simple work injury versus a major accident which causes deaths at a factory. Obviously, the scale and scope and the irremediability are different there. And at the end of the day, how is this represented? So in a risk management system like Prewave, that would be represented in the risk score. So, for instance, in Prewave, you saw that earlier also in this scoping dashboard, a lower score indicates higher risk, meaning a higher likelihood for a certain risk to materialize. Yeah. So that is always how that's handled in systems.
Maybe there's another question for you, Harald.
Yeah.
Where is it? How is it possible to identify the tier and supply chain if the tier one supplier does not want to provide information on that? I think Prewave has to offer something in this regard.
Yes, indeed. So there are today possibilities of identifying supply chains and supply relationships based on publicly available data. And at Prewave, we have such an approach where we can use customs data, we use media data to understand based on documentations, what's available on websites, in annual reports, and various sources to see whether companies are working with each other. And that is what's called a public data supply chain mapping, which can be a first indication to understand whether in your deeper supply chain or behind your tier one supplier, certain high risk connections are visible and available, yeah, which is often the starting point for a risk analysis in the deeper supply chain. Sebastian, I also saw that, not sure if you answered that in writing, but this idea of do I now have to only look at the direct material suppliers, so only the production material suppliers, or is it also the services suppliers? Because we have this concept of the chain of activity, right?
Right.
How does that play together?
So it's not only production material, and I understand that the wording chain of activity is not entirely clear. It says business partners, upstream business partners related to the production of goods or the provision of services. I mean, this is open to interpretation, right? If you are transporting goods, then this is also necessary for you to sell your goods. So the transporting logistics services would also be part of your chain of activities. But if you are using, as I said, toilet paper or water or coffee for the company, for the staff, then probably this is not necessary to produce or to sell the product or to provide the service. But there will be some cases where it is not 100% clear. The same discussions have been existing under the German supply chain, but I don't think in the end that if you're going through your list of supplies, or if you identified certain areas that are problematic, you scope them, and there might be an area that should have been added to the scoped areas and the risky areas that any authority would say, well, this has been done the wrong way, and now we will find the company. So in the end, I think if there is a smaller number of suppliers where it is not 100% clear whether they are part of the chain of activities or not and have been excluded in the risk assessment, this won't be a liability problem under the CSDDD.
All right. Given that we're 5 minutes over and the remaining questions are quite technical, I think it's a good time to end the webinar today. And I would like to thank you, Sebastian, as always, for the great
Thank
insights.
you, Harald.
And also Niels, thank you so much for your comments. And yeah, I look forward to doing this again in the near future. And yeah, wish everybody happy holidays and happy New Year.